Okay, what up, everybody? This is Eric with Mind Melt Podcast, and today is a discussion with my stepfather, who is a Christian. I feel like lately I have been kind of hard on religion, which isn't really new to me, but it's been beaten a little bit on the podcast recently, especially since I've had like Lawrence Krauss and all these freaking atheist people on here. So I wanted to kind of open the floor up to a different belief system and just talk to my stepdad, who, like I said, is a Christian. The topic of our discussion was the utility of religion, and I gotta say that I kind of can see the point of religion having a utility, and so it was a good discussion. I think I mean personally, I definitely think that religion should be kicked out, but I think it does provide utility to society. I just think that society could do better. I think that we could move out of it, and I think that that's kind of evident just in the way that as we progress as a culture, it seems like religion gets less and less of a fundamental. The beliefs get less and less strict, and kind of like the rules start to drop off. And that being said, I really enjoy Russ because he. If every Christian was like Russ, I would totally be into it. um, Mostly because a lot of the stuff in the Bible gets thrown out. So it's really cool to talk to someone that's got a completely different idea of what reality is than me, but we converge on a lot of similar ideas. And I think that it's good to have, a discussion with someone that doesn't think like you do. So I hope that you guys enjoy this. Let me know what you think. And if you do enjoy this, write me an email and we can do something like this again in the future. So the email is mindmeltpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, subscribe and do all that shit. All right. Well, buckle up, bitches. Here's Russ Wright. Okay, I'm here with Russ Wright, who is my stepfather, but him and I both have an interesting path because Russ, you were an atheist or agnostic for a long time, and when I was growing up, I was Christian, and then
Right.
as we both aged, our paths crossed in the opposite direction. So, but before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about like your history as a teacher and kind of what brought you into religion.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, it's really interesting because, I remember when you were quite young, I think you were like 12 years old when your mom and I met ish. And at that point in my life, I had been a fairly avid and I would even go so far as to say antagonistic agnostic / atheist. And so, I remember these experiences where you would come home from the Christian school that we had enrolled you in, and you would be all excited and you would share these ideas with me. And I would try to be not antagonistic with you.
Yeah.
I can remember other experiences with other people where I would just decimate their arguments for Christianity or religious belief. Because I was an English major in college, so I read a lot.
Right.
And as I use that. One of the things I learned about the art of rhetoric is that you can tailor your argument and how you're presenting things to make them sound viable, credible, etc. But if they're not backed up with your own personal experiences, it's really hard to get to the heart of the matter. And I think that that's what's going to be most interesting about our discussion today is that a lot of our own personal experiences will probably fill some of our debate, if you will, right?
Yeah,
our discussion. Yeah. And that's really hard to keep your own personal experiences out of it. So I was a high school teacher after I got out of college, and and taught world religion and world history in a combined class. So I was an English major, but I've always been fascinated by history, and studying English literature, or literature in English, I should say, exposes you to all manner of firsthand history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the study of history that is written by somebody else, and then there's the study of literature written by people who were in that time, in that moment. So if you study Chaucer, for example, or Shakespeare or Spencer, you get firsthand glimpses into the culture of that day, whereas historians often take a more, what's the word I'm looking for, divorced view, if you will. They tend to study events rather than the people who lived those events, right? Or the writings of the people who lived those events. So literature for me was a very fascinating insight into what was going on. And so as I taught world religion / world history, it was funny because I lived in an area at the time, Post Falls, Idaho, where there were a lot of very devout Christians, fundamentalist Christians. And so the students who came into my classes had not really been exposed to a lot of the concepts that come from teaching, like the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu text, or the Quran, or even some of the Sumerian writings that you go, wow, that Sumerian writing sounds awfully like the Epic of Gilgamesh, sounds awfully like the tale of Noah that you read in the Old Testament. And then you learn that the Jewish people were, as part of the Babylonian captivity, were probably reading the Epic of Gilgamesh and may indeed have incorporated that into the Old Testament text.
Right.
Who knows? Who knows where, what came first? But, the fact of the matter is that history is an interesting study of the blend of all these ideas and cultures, and when they come into contact with one another, how they get incorporated or redigested or represented. It's really fascinating. And so, after I quit teaching, because I was, me, I'm not a politician at all. And so there's some politics that go on in the public school arena.
Yeah.
And you and I already talked about that a little bit, but, I went and joined the corporate world and have been there ever since. And I think I've found that to be more fulfilling in a lot of ways. But in my own personal journey, when it comes to, how did I come to go from being an ardent agnostic to being a devout Christian is an interesting one. And so, I had, as we all do, faced my own demons from my childhood, which included being sexually abused, having divorced parents like you do, and all the trauma and the disassociation that comes along with those experiences. And each of us deals it with those types of events in our own way, right? And so some people try to sublimate it, right, or to internalize it, and that's not healthy. And so that's exactly what I did. I joined the Marines, where the mentality obviously is very much you don't ever show emotions, right?
Yeah.
And if you do, you're somehow weaker or less than. And so, and I wasn't just in the Marines, I was in the infantry in the Marines, which is like the guys, right? Of the world. And so coming out of that experience, I was really ashamed and internalized and never discussed some of those experiences that I had as a child. And so they drove all these other behaviors, consumption of alcohol in large quantities. I was actually arrested and charged with a DUI while I was in the Marines. Consumption of illicit drugs, consumption of pornography, things like this that were all very unhealthy behaviors, in the sense that there was no balance to it, right? So I consume alcohol today, but I don't consume it to blot out pain, right? I don't use it as a means of escape. And same with pornography. And that was really what it was an interesting experience, brought me to a fork in the road. Right. And so, it was a horrific experience, and I'll spare the audience the details, but let's just say that my pornography habit suddenly became known, right? When all these years I knew it was wrong. I didn't,
Yeah.
but I couldn't stop. And so, then my wife found out about it, your mom. She was really, really crushed. My family found out about it, right? And all of a sudden, all these things that I had pretended to be for so many years kind of came crumbling down.
That's really
Right?
interesting. Yeah, like your identity kind of fell apart. I never really thought about that.
Well, yeah. I mean, as an addict,
Mhm.
it's been my experience, and I can't speak to the experience of other addicts, but it's been my experience that addicts try very hard to create a representation of themselves so that they can hide what's really going on underneath. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I just remember this so clearly. I'm because your mom didn't want me sleeping in our bedroom for quite a while. And so I was actually sleeping on the floor of Jake's bedroom, my
Wow.
son,
Yeah.
Jake's, for
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
audience. And so, I just remember thinking, I don't know what to do. I am at a complete loss. The image that I had carefully constructed as an addict had been completely torn down. Right.
Mhm.
And I didn't know what else to do. And here's the irony of it all. As a almost lifelong atheist / agnostic, I hit my knees and started praying.
Hmm.
And here's the really weird part. And it's almost funny in retrospect. It wasn't funny at the time. But the weird part was I kept just hearing this message, if you will, of, well, just tell the truth.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, why would I ever want to do that?
Yeah.
The truth is just going to cause more pain, more suffering, more embarrassment, more shame for me, et
Hmm.
cetera. But as it turns out, that's exactly what needed to happen.
Hmm.
And that's, the old saying, tell the truth and the truth shall set you free,
Yeah.
is, in my experience anyway, a fundamental truth.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
agree
an
with you.
inescapable one. So,
Yeah, I agree. I think that like being honest, well, telling the truth starts with telling the truth to yourself. And I think that a lot of times a lie starts with lying to ourselves. And when you're lying to yourselves, you can start to get away with something because you can justify it in any way possible because you're not being honest with yourself.
exactly right. It's
Yeah.
funny because 4 years later from that incident I just described, I do a lot of work with other men who are struggling to cope with addiction to pornography.
Hmm.
And that thing you just said is something I just kind of blindly stumbled on when I was having a conversation with a fellow addict. I said, the first person an addict lies to is himself.
Yeah.
And he's usually the last person to figure that out.
Oh, yeah. I agree with
Right.
that too. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
I said that to him, and I kind of went, holy crap. That's another fundamental truth.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. I think that because obviously, and the viewers know this, that I had a meth addiction. So having a meth addiction is like the scariest thing that I've definitely ever experienced and the hardest thing I've ever gone through. And so I think it's really interesting that you and I have two experiences that are almost identical in the way that, addiction's an addiction.
Yep.
And,
Agreed.
and yet we somehow managed to come out of it with two different lenses. Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's
I
that's why
never went, yeah, I never went the direction of praying or anything like that to stop it, and I personally, I never felt like I needed to consult with a higher authority or anything. I just stuck my nose down and, I had family, I had friends, support, my dog and things like that. But when it came down to making the ultimate decision to stop, it had a lot to do with me just saying, I need to stop this, And so I do think it's really interesting that, and this isn't rare to us. There's lots of people out there that have different experiences on kicking addictions in numerous different ways. So,
yeah, it's interesting because the experience coming out of that, and meth is, as far as I know, one of those chemicals that once it gets its hooks into you is incredibly hard to shake off.
oh
So
yeah.
I
Yeah.
would say, you're to be commended for putting your nose to the grindstone, as it were, and finding a way to try to combat that addiction. You know, and I think what's interesting to me about addiction is that typically there's a root cause to it, right?
Mhm.
So we made those choices as addicts at some point to engage in certain behaviors, whether it be alcohol or meth or marijuana, workaholism,
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
overeating,
Yeah. Sugar.
isolation. There's all kinds of addictions out there.
Yeah.
The question becomes like, when you have an addiction, the way that I try to classify it is you try to stop, but you can't find a way to do it, right?
Mhm.
And typically for most addicts, and maybe this isn't true with you, but for most addicts, it involves getting outside help because you've found it to be impossible to do by yourself.
Mhm.
And that's where the power of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Sex Addicts Anonymous has come into play, is that they surround those addicts with people who have had the same experience, and they share, here's what got me sober. This may not get you sober, but doing this work in this way got me sober. So I'm happy to share my experience with you to see if it works for you.
Mhm.
So it's just a really interesting phenomenon, and there's no science to it,
Yeah.
but yet Alcoholics Anonymous, especially, has proven to be a method by which people can successfully, I wouldn't say overcome their addiction, but successfully find a way to stop engaging in it.
So I mean, I have a question, and this is going to get kind of outside of our discussion today, but like with Alcoholics Anonymous not publishing any data, I mean, how do we know that it is really all that effective?
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of it, right? Because Alcoholics Anonymous is anonymous for a reason, right?
Mhm.
That's part of their creed, that we don't engage in self-promotion.
Right.
And so if you follow the initial set of steps or guidelines that came out in the late 1930s with Alcoholics Anonymous, it's very much about spreading the message through personal experience. And so therefore, they don't put any science to it. They don't collect any data. They roughly and loosely track membership. And by their own internal estimates, and I don't know what rigor or methodology they follow to get these numbers, but millions and millions of people have successfully gone through that. And so, being that it comes down to its own personal experience kind of thing, really the only value or stock you can put into it is walking into a room full of addicts and seeing that they've somehow changed their lives through this experience to overcome their addiction, or to find a successful way of stop engaging in it, is a
Mhm.
better way to say it. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I have my own qualms with AA, and it just has to do with my personal experience, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier.
sure.
So, but, just like what I've found with it is, and this is just me, because I know a lot of people that have successfully done AA. Although the people that I know that have successfully done it only did it successfully for a certain period of time, and then they eventually relapsed. So I know people that swore by it, and then 2-3 years later we're back into it. So I don't, I do know people that have been successful, like, Chris, and that have been successful with for 4 years with it. But I think that my problem with Alcoholics Anonymous is that it doesn't teach people how to be self-reliant. It teaches them how to rely on others almost more than themselves. And I just don't see that being a real strong foundation.
That's interesting because, and I've memorized large portions of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah.
um, and so one of the primary tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous is that we do not get better so long as, and I'm quoting directly here, we do not get better so long as we place our dependence on others ahead of
Okay.
our dependence on God or our higher power. And so very much it is you can depend on other people, but that's not going to get you very far.
Yeah.
But by the fact that you're surrounding yourself with other people who have had a similar experience, you can see how the principles of the program have come to play a role in their sobriety.
Mm-hmm.
That's I guess what I was driving at. Not that other people are going to get you sober, but seeing that their experiences will help inspire the idea that I too can get sober.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting. I mean, I guess it's just, I think it's person to person, obviously on how effective it is, because like every time because, I had to go to AA meetings, but because I was forced to by probation. And so like when I went to AA meetings, I'm sure it was a lot of my own reluctance and probably a lot of my own like strong-headedness as to why it wasn't really effective for me. But being surrounded by people that were talking about their addictions was really difficult for me because it made me want to do my addiction,
Right. Yeah. It's in the rooms that I go to for sex addiction, we are very, very careful not to allow, especially new people coming into the room, to allow them to engage in anecdotal type discussions.
Okay.
For that very reason you just described, because it's like, oh yeah, I really struggled this last week. And I was watching this really sexy woman walk down the sidewalk and she was wearing this and doing that. And then she started flirting with me. Well, that's going to trigger a whole bunch of guys in the room.
Right. And that's kind of what I struggled with. So I guess it just is dependent upon what group you go to, maybe. I don't know.
Totally. That's been my experience.
Yeah.
When I first started going to the rooms, one meeting I went to was probably much like, it sounds like the type of meeting you went to. It was just a bunch of guys sitting around complaining about how horrible their week was.
Right.
And Eric, I would leave this meeting and I would feel like, man, I feel worse than when I came in.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
exactly. I'm like, how is this going to help me?
Yeah.
But, by good luck or the grace of God or whatever you want to call it, I found another meeting and I was like, oh, these guys seem to know the answers. These guys have some sobriety behind them. These guys seem to be put together. But, we need to be careful because that's not always the case. And that's why the message, we don't place our recovery in a way that makes it dependent on other people.
Right.
It can't work that way. Other people are fallible. Other people are fall short of perfection. I don't know anybody that's perfect. Right. And so that's where we got to be careful in our recovery.
Yeah.
It's like, if I'm looking at other people, I just want to be looking at them in the way of what's possible if they seem to be on a good track, what's possible for me, what might I borrow from them that could work for me versus, oh, that guy's got 20 years of sobriety. He must be some kind of demigod, so I'm going to go walk around and worship him. That's where we got to be careful.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Well, that's cool. I think that kind of narrows down like a little bit of your past. So let's get into what we wanted to talk about a little bit. And that is the utility of religion. And I'd like to know, before we get into that, first off, what are your beliefs? I mean, if you want to, we can talk about it. And if you think that it's irrelevant to this discussion, we don't have to. But I do think that it would be important to lay out the groundwork of what you think religion is, or I know that there's a really broad context. So when we talk about the utility of religion, we can talk about religion as a whole, which is very generalized, or we can talk about kind of like your perception of what religion is, or...
No, I think I did some research in advance of our discussion, and I think, because I'm a Christian, and I would describe myself as a devout Christian, right. But I think we have to be careful there, because a lot of people say, well, a Christian means that you must be, a devotee of how Abraham, in the Old Testament looked at it, or the way that David in the Old Testament looked at it. And the thing that a lot of Christians and non-Christians alike probably don't realize is that when Christ came along, all the rules changed.
Yeah.
And so what he brought along with him was, and in fact, it's ironic. I heard this message in church today. He's like, look, we following rules, like especially the old tradition or the Old Testament rules, like you can't eat anything with a cloven hoof, or you have to go sacrifice animals to God, etc. We're somehow going to get you closer to God or make you more acceptable to God. And Christ came along and said, no, that's not the case.
Yeah.
All I need you to do is to love God and love each other. And you're all going to fall short of the idea of perfection. Everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what do you do when you do fall short? Do you run off to church and open the Bible and somehow think that that's going to fix it? That's not what fixes it. Fixing it is recognizing that I fall short and I will always fall short, and that's okay. I don't claim perfection. What I try to claim is progress.
Mm-hmm.
Progress in being more Christ-like, progress in being a more kinder, loving person, and emulating those things that Christ taught us to do, which is to be forgiving, to be full of grace toward other people, to recognize that they, like me, are going to fall short of the idea of perfection. And that's one of the fundamental concepts of recovery too in the room, is that if I have expectations of other people, all I'm doing is setting myself up for disappointment.
Right.
So in the rooms, we say expectations are simply premeditated resentments.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I go, well, Eric, as a man in Western society, I have these certain expectations that you're going to, cut your hair short, shave your beard, go to work, punch the clock. Those are my expectations of you. I've already set myself up for something called disappointment.
Yeah.
Eric may go, well, I don't want to do those things.
Yeah.
I don't want to punch a clock. I don't want to shave my face. In fact, I want to grow my hair out long.
Like Jesus.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I wasn't going that direction. But
yeah, I know.
exactly. Yeah.
So, okay. So now, do you think that it's just by accident that you happen to be a Christian and Christianity happens to be a Western religion?
Yeah, I do. By virtue of where I was born and the exposure that I've had. Yeah, that's the God I knew. I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian household. It was Mormon. And so that's how I came to be an atheist. Because I looked, and here's the thing, I think we need to be careful of, is like, am I looking at the idea of God, or am I looking at people who try to understand the idea of God? Because if I'm looking at people who are themselves imperfect and trying to understand the idea of God, of course I'm going to say that religion falls short. Of course I'm going to say that the idea of God falls short, because I'm looking at other people who are imperfect and fallible.
Right.
So yeah, I would say that there are many ways. I think this is where you're going. There are many ways to come to know God.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's through Buddha, and other Christians are probably falling off their chairs when they hear me say this, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Is it, do I come to know
doesn't
God?
Jesus say that the only way is through
Him.
Jesus in the light?
Yeah. But keep in mind that for Christians, he was God on earth, right?
Uh-huh.
So when he says that, the only way to heaven is through me.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, really? Is it the idea that I'm coming to know God through what Jesus is telling me? Or, for other people who've never been exposed, let's say I was born in India, and I'm some, I've, what do they call them? The untouchables. I was born into the untouchable caste. How am I ever going to get exposed to the idea or the concept of Christianity? Chances are I'm not.
Right.
But built within each of us, I think, is a desire to understand and know justice.
Okay.
Right. And so the fundamental concept of justice is, are we all treated with the same love, compassion, kindness that I would want shown to me, I would show to somebody else. Right.
Okay.
That's a fundamental inherent human trait. And whether somebody who's a Hindu or somebody who's a Muslim or somebody who's a Buddhist, are they following what I would call fundamental concepts of, and we talked about this the other day, my rights only go so far as they don't trample somebody else's right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and when I talk about rights, I want to be careful about separating that from ideas of privilege. Right. So there's fundamental rights and then there's privileges. Do I have a fundamental right to have a driver's license and own a car and drive it around? No, I don't. But I do have a fundamental right to life. I do have a fundamental right to freedom. But my freedom only goes so far as it doesn't trample somebody else's right to freedom. Right? My right to pursue happiness only goes so far as it doesn't infringe upon somebody else's right to pursue happiness.
So just to intersect there for a second, didn't
Sure.
Jesus say, like, love your slave masters, even the, bad ones, or the um, even the mean ones, angry ones? I can't remember.
Well, yeah, but there's a difference between loving somebody and tolerating their behavior.
But I'm saying Jesus doesn't really rebuke slavery, which is like totally trampling someone's freedom.
Well, I think we have to be careful there too. So the concept and idea of slavery in the Middle East in Jesus's time was different than what many Americans understand slavery to be. And on top of that too, Jesus consorted with slaves. He consorted with prostitutes. He consorted with tax collectors who were like probably the Middle Eastern Jesus Day version of drug dealers.
Yeah.
Government thugs maybe is a better way to put it.
Yeah.
And so, tax collectors in that time were people who earned a commission off of going and extorting money from everyday citizens in the form of quote unquote taxation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So tax collectors were universally reviled in especially in Israel at that time because they were occupied by Romans. And so these tax collectors were going around collecting money for Caesar, under whose thumb they were currently living. And so they were viewed not only as IRS agents, but also as traitors to their own race, the Jewish race. So, but Jesus was like, "Hey, tax collector, come sit down and have dinner with me. Let's have a cup of wine. Prostitute, come have dinner with me. Let's have a cup of wine." And at that time, breaking bread with somebody was a sacred ritual. It wasn't like we think of it today when you invite somebody over to our house to have dinner. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily a friend.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a business occasion, or it might be, hey, we just want to get to know you better to decide if we need to be friends, right? But in that day, breaking bread with somebody at the dinner table was saying, you are my friend.
Yeah.
And so Jewish culture at the time, and this is where we got to be careful to put the proper context around the idea of slavery. Did slavery exist? Yes. Was it like the modern day version of slavery where we had African Americans? No. In fact, in that day, slaves often became heirs to their master's fortunes. They could inherit the master's domain, their farm, et cetera. So was it reprehensible? Yeah, especially from our modern lens of looking at it. But that's where we got to be careful. Let's not put the modern lens on it.
So do you take the notion that slaves are just like indentured servants back then? Or do you think that they were slaves? Because I think that I do agree with you. I think that it's bad to try to get mixed up into the idea that they were like, like the African Americans were treated here. But to me, a slave is still a slave back then. It's someone that was owned by someone else.
Yeah, and their lives and their livelihood were controlled by somebody else who had ultimate authority and discretion over them. And again, reprehensible practice from our modern day view.
So why wouldn't Jesus say slave owners don't own slaves instead of slaves love your slave owners?
Well, because Jesus's primary message was one of love, compassion, and forgiveness, regardless of your station in life.
Okay.
So Jesus could have easily come along and said, another reprehensible practice that was horrific, whether it's a modern view or a view back then, was prostitution. He could have said, we need to stop prostitution right now. We need to stop the illegal occupation of Romans of Jewish territory right now. It's horrible. It's, we need to stop the practice of what the Romans did, where they had gladiators go into the arena and slaughter animals. There were all sorts of reprehensible practices back then. So
I think that this is actually a really good way of getting into the utility of religion, because
right.
What I'm kind of hearing you say basically is back then it was important for religion to give context to behaviors that were going on back then, right?
Well, I think religion should exist outside of the context of behaviors.
Okay.
Because Jesus's primary message was one of love, compassion, and forgiveness, regardless of what was going on.
No baggage. I mean, you know what I mean? Or the Jainism, there's that is the picture perfect, treat everything with respect, and I mean, obviously I'm not a Jain, and I don't think that that's any way to live your life, but what I'm trying to say is, when you have a book like the Bible that has, I mean, I guess I understand. So from my perspective as an atheist, when I look at the Old Testament and the time that it was back then, and there was utility, because the laws, for example, maybe don't eat pork, if that's a law, that makes sense, because maybe back then if you ate pork you would get a stomach bug, right? And
pork is horrible.
Yeah. And
right.
So, and then you'd get really sick, so you would think that God was cursing you because we didn't understand what was creating sickness back then. They just attributed it to God, right? So then they're like, oh my gosh, God doesn't like it when we eat pork. So then they write down a law. God says don't eat pork. But the utility back then would be, they didn't understand that there was a virus or something in their stomach, a trichinosis or whatever it may have been. They didn't understand that. So they attributed it to a God. And then the utility being that back then, when they don't understand what's creating sickness, if they have a law written down, don't do this because bad things happen, then there is utility in that. And so I guess what I'm arguing is that I think that as we get further in society and progress, it's time to shed some of these,
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying, because so I think that the definition of utility expands to something more than just rules that we follow to provide some sort of individual or even communal benefit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can look at utilitarian benefits from a purely individual level. So I could say quite easily, for example, in my experience with addiction, is that I have been freed from the chains of my addiction as a result of, my developing a relationship with my higher power, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very individual and utilitarian benefit that I've experienced. But you would look at that as an addict and go, but I didn't have to do that.
Right.
Right. So in the interest of being really scientific about this, I did some research. I shared with you that I did a little bit of prep for our call, and I came because I had never really considered the concept of, can religion as a whole, not just Christianity, because we've kind of bled over into the, how can people come to know God if they've never been exposed to Christianity, and does that conflict with the basic fundamental precepts of Christianity? I don't think it does, based on how I read it, but that's my own individual interpretation, and many Christians would probably disagree with that. Yeah. But even so, if I run across somebody who is not a Christian, who is, say, for instance, a devout, and I've never even heard of the Jainism religion, so I'm not even sure what that is. So if I ran into a Jainist and I said, hey, I'm a devout Christian, and somehow I am feeling insecure in my own beliefs because you don't subscribe to it, so I'm going to try to convert you.
Uh-huh.
You've already violated a fundamental precept that Christ tried to teach, which is love, accept, forgive, find compassion, break bread with prostitutes and tax collectors, because everybody, I think, a fundamental desire of most human beings, if they haven't been through some sort of extreme trauma, is to want to be accepted and loved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
all sorts of people will probably claim that they don't, but I would argue that there's probably some trauma behind why they're saying that, right? Yeah. And so, I think that's where we need to be careful about the utility of religion in the broader sense. I don't think it applies just to Christianity. Okay. I think there's a very broad societal and individual benefit to having religion in our communities. And, so I'd like to share some of the research that I found that kind of blew my mind, because I'd never thought of it from this perspective before. Because when you and I were talking the other night about the concept of, does religion provide any sort of utility to our society, I was like, I'd never really thought of it in that broad of a sense. Mm-hmm. Of course, I would want people to have the experiences with Christianity that I've had, because I've found joy and freedom in that, and I would want other people to experience that. But if they find joy and freedom and a sense of love and compassion and forgiveness in other means, as a Christian, I would want to find joy in that as well, even if they're a Jainist or a Hindu because at the end of the day, what do we want humanity to look like? Do we want it to be filled with violence and disgust, or do we want it to be filled with happiness and joy and fulfillment and meaning?
Yeah, I just think that, to kind of piggyback on that, I would say that the problem is that there are religions, like you're taking a very, very, very nuanced, vague way of looking at Christianity. I hope that's not offensive, but I do find it, I find it to be, if every Christian thought the way that you did, I probably wouldn't be so vocal about it. But that being said, there are other religions like Islam where there is direct orders to, have jihad, which is a holy war
right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is that while I appreciate your perception of that, is when people Los Angeles lawyers join ISIS because they have found the same kind of revelations that you have through Christianity, and then they join fundamentalist Islam and start wanting to fight Christians, then we have this issue where religion isn't promoting peace, it's promoting violence.
Yeah. So for me, there's this concept in the recovery rooms that are driven under, AA ideas of how do we overcome or battle our addictions successfully, that everybody is spiritually sick in one sense or another. And here's what's interesting to me about the concept of spiritual sickness. When somebody's dying of cancer in the hospital, we don't go to their bedside and say, man, you're such a dick. Why did you get cancer? This is making me feel horrible.
Yeah.
We don't do that. We go to them and we say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that you're afflicted with this horrible scourge that we call cancer. What can I do to help you? But we don't use that same behavior when it comes to spiritual sickness. So when somebody acts out in a selfish, angry, resentful, fearful way, what we do, especially when that impacts us, is we go, you're a dick. Why did you do that? Whereas if we treated spiritual sickness more along the lines of physical sickness, and we went, wow, there's something inherently hurtful in that person. I wonder why. What can I do to be of help to them? And now I'm not saying that that's easy. It's much easier to treat somebody that's physically sick with compassion and understanding, because we can see that it's not their fault, right?
Mhm.
When it comes to spiritual sickness, some of that spiritual sickness may indeed be of their own doing, right?
Well,
Um,
what do you consider to be spiritual sickness, though? I mean, because we can't even measure that. That's such a
oh,
my
I think
version of spiritual sickness would be much different than yours would be. I would say, because I don't
perhaps,
believe in
perhaps, but I
spirits.
think we can agree upon fundamental behaviors that we described earlier. That my rights only go so far as they don't trample on yours.
But
So,
then again, we have disagreements on abortion.
well, yeah, we can get
So
to that in a minute, but
yeah,
let's explore this idea of spiritual sickness more fully.
okay,
So, spiritual sickness is whenever I act. Now, this is my own definition, and I'll apologize to the writers of the Big Book of AA because it's lifted directly from there. But spiritual sickness, in my view, comes down to whenever I act out of my own selfish interests and trample somebody else's rights, or I use resentments or fear or dishonesty to try to get something that I want at the expense of other people.
hmm
That's spiritual sickness.
okay,
So it's a pretty fundamental thing, right?
yeah,
But it covers, here's what I like about it. What it covers is a broad swath of misbehavioral interactions, right?
hmm
So whenever you see somebody in traffic cut somebody else off, well, it's really easy to go, man, that guy's a dick. What a dick. And I'm going to tailgate him. And I've been guilty of this many times, right? I'm going to get right up on his butt and show him who spots,
right,
right? Well, I've just used, and maybe that person didn't even do that intentionally. They didn't see me. I was in their blind spot or whatever, or maybe they did do it intentionally, but I can't guess at that person's intentions, but we try to all the time. And then we react accordingly. Well, you cut me off, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to get in front of you and cut you off, and then where does that lead us? An eye for an eye makes a whole world blind kind of thing, right?
right, yeah,
And so we have to be really, really careful to separate the spiritual sickness, both in ourselves primarily and in others, by focusing primarily on a message of love, compassion, forgiveness, and understanding. And
okay,
then looking for ways we can be helpful to other people rather than hurtful. So it comes down to, I'm going to make a choice. And so this is where my own personal religious beliefs come in. Do I turn toward the type of person that God wants me to be, or do I turn away from that and use my own personal desires of anger, retribution, and revenge to get what I want, rather than going, man, that dude just cut me off in traffic. Oh, I hope he has a good day. I hope it gets better for him. Right?
yeah.
Some pretty fundamental behavioral differences that, in my view, can lead to chain reactions in the behavior of others. Right?
Yeah. I'm just curious though, why that has to be said with God and I mean, just because while I agree with you that that's a great way to live by, right? I mean, like I said before, if every Christian was like you, I'm all for it. I mean, that's fine. But the problem is that like your version of what spiritual sickness is a lot different than what a Muslim's version of spiritual sickness is, or a fundamentalist Christian even.
Well, but there again, what we have to be careful to do is separate out a person's idea of what spirituality looks like versus what God's idea of what spirituality should look like.
But I
And
mean,
Jesus
okay,
was really clear about it.
yeah, but that's presupposing that first of all Christianity is true, and it's also not taking into consideration that, I mean, the 1.3 billion people that believe in Islam, they're not going to, I just don't, I agree with you that it's subjective, like that's looking at it subjectivity instead of like objectively, but I don't really understand how we can be sure that the message of Jesus is the objective truth. You know what I mean? I just,
Well, yeah. I mean, but that's the beauty of it all, right? Is that we get the freedom to choose. We all
yes.
get the freedom to choose what to do and how to believe. And if
But that's like, I mean, I'm not trying to interrupt you here. I just like,
that's right.
I just think that that's really getting away from, I agree with you 100% on this, right? I mean, I really do, but I don't see how, if we give, I mean, I think people should have the choice as well, but that's why I think education should come first. But you're saying we should accept everybody. Does that mean that we should just, if Islam is their ideology is making them kill thousands and thousands of people?
No, that's not at all what I've said. So let me.
Right. No, I agree with you. That's not what you've said. I'm just trying to get clarification here, because if we allow them to, like, that's their belief, right? So if we are loving them through that, because for some reason they think that they've gotten this message from the divine to slaughter thousands of people. I mean, how do we determine where, from a Christian standpoint, how did we determine when to step in? You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. So Jesus was very much a pacifist.
Okay.
Right?
Muhammad, very much not.
Right. And so, but Jesus never said we had to say, I'm going to accept that behavior. What Jesus said was that we would approach that person with forgiveness and love in our hearts, right? Now here's the interesting dichotomy there for me, because coming out of the Marines, I have a very militant mindset, right? I'm going to protect what's mine and protect those that I love.
Yeah.
Right. And, so in the Marines, it was love of country, right? That we were there to protect our country and the ideals that we should all hopefully be striving toward. We don't seem to be anymore, but, a lot of the Marines I know have carried that mindset into civilian life after leaving. And how do you reconcile that with the ideas that Jesus put in place? And all I can say is, man, my basic instinct overrides a lot of what Jesus would like me to be. I'm imperfect. I wish I could be a total pacifist like Jesus was. I just struggle with the idea that I would allow, let's say, fundamentalist Muslims to overtake the country and completely implement Sharia law and force me and my wife to adhere to their components of the religion. I would like to think that I could be a complete pacifist and go, well, I'm just going to accept that you're going to kill me for not being a Muslim. But I don't know that I could do that. But then again, I'm not Jesus. So that's all I can say.
The problem that I have with this, though, is that, like, in one sense, you're saying that we should all strive to be more like Jesus.
Right.
And in another sense, you're saying, but I, in this sense, can determine what's moral, right? I mean,
I can't determine what's moral.
Okay.
I can only look at my own behavior and go, did that rise to the expectation you had for me? No, I fell short. So I'm going to ask for forgiveness and try to move on without living in shame about it.
Okay. Okay. So let's get back to the utility part.
Yeah.
And like, here's something I want to point out. And I guess you can respond to it however you choose. But, like, I tend to think that as we progress as a culture, and a good example of this is just comparing a country like the United States to a country like Iran. Mm-hmm. As we progress and we slowly start to shed the ideals of religion. So, for example, 2,000 years ago, maybe in Rome, during the Dark Ages, right? Mm-hmm. The Catholic Church was pretty much the rule. Mm-hmm. And during that time, it was basically a theocracy, right? I mean,
they had some horrific extremes of much along the lines of what some of these radical Muslims are doing today. Yep.
Right. Exactly. So as culture and society progressed, we have gotten out of the theocracy and moved into more of a secularist type of nation. As America as a nation has moved more towards secularism.
Mm-hmm.
Although we do have religion in this country, I would argue that most people that are religious don't live by the laws of religion, like yourself.
Of course not.
Yeah.
We're
So,
imperfect.
but my point is that with the utility of religion, like that's kind of what we're trying to talk about.
Right.
If we have literally come to the point where as society progresses, we lose more and more of the fundamentals of religion, and society gets better and better, as seen current day with countries that are ruled by Islam versus countries that are secular. That's moving away from religion. That's like we're saying, okay, fine, you guys can still practice religion, but we need to keep it out of our state, right? And then as we progress, it's like the Bible becomes less and less of a book to adhere to. It's like, okay, maybe you guys can wear mixed fabric. Maybe you can eat shellfish. Gays, you know what? We're going to let gays get married. And it's like we're slowly losing all of these rules that have been set before by religion. And that is making culture progress, I would say, in a positive way. Now, I think that there's probably, an argument to be made that there's also, you can go all the way over to the Mao type of China. Mm-hmm. And that is like I fundamentally disagree with that, which is basically forcing atheism upon people, Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that that's right either. But mm-hmm. So my point is that as we get into modern day and continue to progress, it seems like we're losing more and more of religion, and society is getting better and better and better.
Maybe.
So I'm wondering if we just trash can ideology. Let's say that we write a new Bible, okay? And the new Bible has your verse from Jesus in there, and it also is, got a little bit of the Declaration of Independence in there. Everybody has
fundamental rights.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yep. So and we get rid of this this idea of basically we get rid of the need to have something that is unfalsifiable, because God is unfalsifiable, right? So we're presupposing something that we don't need, in my opinion.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did, I just completely stumbled upon it, mm-hmm. Was I just Googled utility or the utility of religion in society.
Okay.
And I came across this very, very interesting study. It was put together by a gentleman by the name of Harold Koenig. He is has a doctorate of psychiatry. He works for the Department of Medicine and Psychiatry at Duke University. And one of the things that he did was a meta study. And as I poured through his research, I came to understand, and this is a relatively new concept to me. So for those of you listening out there in radio land, if you laugh at my expense, that's okay. So this idea of meta studies was to me very fascinating, and really kind of the first time that I've come upon this concept. So the idea of a meta study is to take thousands of studies, scientific studies that were done, and aggregate the data.
Right.
And you use the term presuppose. So I really like that term, because a lot of people conduct studies with the presupposition, and this is where science can get off the rails. Mm-hmm. They come into a study with the presupposition of a determined outcome, even though they may claim, oh no, I'm going to be 100% neutral about this. I don't think it's possible for humans to be 100% neutral.
I would agree. Yeah.
And so what Dr. Koenig did was he surveyed 3,300 data-based quantitative research studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals for the last 140 years.
Okay.
And of those 3,300 studies, 2,100 of them, so 2/3, were done between the years 2000 and 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And these studies were done in a wide range of disciplines, including medicine, nursing, physical and occupational therapy, public health, sociology, psychology, spirituality, pastoral care, go on, right? So these covered a broad spectrum of disciplines. And so what he asked was a very fundamental question. Does religion and spirituality provide any benefit to both the individual and the community outside of just being spiritual or showing up to church to feel better about myself, right? Mm-hmm. And so there were some really interesting outcomes. And so what he did was, when he took those 3,300 studies, he said, well, let's first define these 3,300 studies. All looked at the lift or lack thereof, or the harm of being religious or spiritual in terms of your own mental health, in terms of benefit to society, in terms of your physical health. So are people who go to church or claim to be religious or spiritual more healthy mentally, physically, and do they provide a better benefit to society by being more kind, forgiving, helpful, etc.? So he very carefully defined, what does it mean to be religious and what does it mean to be spiritual, both of which there's a huge overlap, because you could claim to be spiritual but not religious, mm-hmm. right? Because religion is just a man-made, organized attempt to bring people together in an agreed upon pursuit of what God needs us to do, right? Yeah. So that's religion. And so he didn't distinguish between Christianity or Buddhism or Islam. He just said, are you religious or do you claim to be spiritual? And so his definition of spiritual excluded things like humanism or morality or value systems, right? So spiritual for him was the pursuit of that which is sacred or transcendent, outside of ourselves, and intimately connected to the supernatural. So there's obviously a lot of overlap between religion and spirituality. And indeed, you could say so much so that they come close to being identical, right? Mm-hmm. And so what was really interesting to me too was he didn't just accept these 3,300 studies that were done on the benefits of being religious or spiritual at face value. He hired an independent auditing firm to go through all 3,300 of these studies and rate them according to their methodological quality. So they looked at things like, did you, I'm going to read my paper here. How well was the study designed? Was it a clinical trial? Was it a cross-sectional study? What was your sampling method? What were the number of your measures that you looked at? What were the quality of those measures? And he had each of those studies rated from a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of their quality and their discipline and rigor, right, of doing that study. And so as he went through and provided the outcomes of these things from several different dimensions, he would say, well, of all the studies, we found that X was the result. But if I look at the more rigorous studies, a score of 7 or higher, this was the result. And so I found that to be quite fascinating in terms of some of the outcomes that he found. And so what he did was he looked at, does being religious or spiritual impact how positive your emotions are? And he broke it down into well-being and happiness, hope, optimism, meaning and purpose, self-esteem, sense of control, positive character traits. Does it give you the ability to come through events in your life that are negative, like the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, natural disasters, etc.? Does it give people more
hope,
elasticity?
Okay.
Right, to cope with those things.
Yeah.
He also studied dimensions around depression, anxiety, psychotic disorders, personality traits, including psychoticism, neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness, etc. How does it help people with substance abuse and social problems? And here's what was most interesting to me. Does it impact people's physical health to be more religious or spiritual?
Yeah.
And so we can go through some of the examples, but what I would say after reading through this quite thoroughly is that if I was a medical doctor and somebody came in with a physical problem or a mental problem, if I read through all of these studies, I would say the first prescription I'm going to write is for you to go to church.
Yeah. Okay. I really want you to keep going with this, but I'd just like to point out that I think that this is just my opinion, obviously, but I think that a huge problem with this kind of study would be that we're not I mean, I don't know if you are or not, but we're not taking into consideration that religion and ideology has been something that has been such a huge part of the human history, and it was so important for culture and society, in my opinion. Back in the day, I think that there was serious benefits of religion back in the day. And so that being said, I think that the problem is that when we look at whether or not these things are true, we're not really taking into consideration that we are instilling all of these things into children when they're born. For the most part, society and culture does that. And then when those things are taken away, it's like going to make people lost. But if we taught children from a young age, no ideology, question everything, we have no evidence for a higher power, etc., then kids would not go into like this frame of work. Like they wouldn't go into it. It just would have no bearing on these kinds of studies, because people would be not so attached to, I don't know how to explain it. I'm trying to look for a word here, but I think that the problem is that religion has played such a major role in like for me, for example, I grew up with it. It was around me all the time. When I decided to start to come away from it, which I would say was like when I was 16 or 15, when I started to come away from it, it was detrimental for me because I didn't see what the point of life was. I didn't understand what death was. If there's no heaven, where's my family? All of these things were extremely emotionally taxing and drove me into despair, basically, because I didn't have a structure. You know what I mean? Life didn't make sense anymore. I was like burdened with this ideology that I was like basically born into. And then once I started to question it and really start to investigate it, then I just was really confused. And I would say that caused a lot of stress and health problems for me, etc. So, but now I would be willing to bet that if I were to take some of these same, examinations, like I would probably come out ahead of the game as well. And I have no religion at all. So do you understand what I'm saying here?
Maybe. I think there's so many factors that go into one individual's experiences that we have to be careful to acknowledge the fact that each person's experiences are so unique to themselves that they may not necessarily apply. So, for example, earlier, you had mentioned, the problem with Islam, which is a huge concern, especially within what I would call more conservative circles of our society, around the idea of radical Islam. And yet, if you start to break down, it garners a lot of news. It garners a lot of attention because of the radical nature of their behaviors, right? Throwing gay people off of buildings is really radical and horrific. And you go, oh my gosh. And then they say on the news, well, that's what Islam teaches, right? Uh-huh. And yet we've got hundreds and hundreds of millions of Muslims who don't do that.
But I would argue that the reason that they're not doing that is because they're not following the hadith or the or the Quran.
Right.
So they're not actually adhering to Islam.
Right. So that's where it comes down to individual choices and going, hey, do I want that and that internal code that I referred to earlier about a sense of justice for myself and for others. If something in the Bible or something in the Quran or something in, take whatever religion you want to, or even indeed in scientific literature that contradicts my inherent notion of rightness and fairness, I can be free to ignore that. And that's the beauty of freedom and the beauty of being human, is that we can say, that doesn't ring true to me, but there are other ideas or concepts in this religion or in this belief system or in this scientific findings, take your pick, that I can latch onto that do promote my ideas of rightness and fairness and justice. Because I could argue, for example, that scientific findings would show us that clearly, economically, it makes no sense to keep a person born with Down syndrome alive.
Right.
So if we find out at birth that they're born with Down syndromes, economically, scientifically, it makes complete sense to put that person, that infant, to death on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
Because the amount of time, money, effort, emotions, whatever, that are going to go into keeping that person alive and viable in our world today go beyond the pale. But what you routinely find in the human experience is that people take those interactions with, let's say, somebody who never gets beyond the mental age of 2 or 4 because of some genetic disability they were born with, that other people around them, it brings the better out in those people because of the extent that they have to go to in living up to their own internal code of what's just and fair to keep that person with that severe disability alive brings enormous emotional rewards, even at the greater expense of society as a whole.
Right.
So do we want to follow the purely scientific or the purely Islamic belief that certain behaviors or certain things should happen in the interest of following something rigorously? Or should we bounce that up against our own internal code and go, man, I could put that baby to death because they have Down syndrome and it'll save them and me a lot of grief. But in that moment, that may feel like the right thing. But as time and distance and experience show, that indeed was not the right thing for a whole host of immeasurable reasons. And we can't quantify them, but we can qualify them. And that's the problem we often get into, is quantifying things versus qualifying them. And what I mean by that is, what is the emotional experience and the personal growth I've had as a result of doing something that in the moment may not have felt like the right thing to do, but some internal sense of justice and fairness told me I should.
Yeah.
So that being said, the other thing I want to point out too about the studies that I was quoting earlier was it wasn't just a study of religious and spiritual people. It was a study of everybody. And part of the study was, how religious or spiritual would you gauge yourself on a scale of, say, 0 to 10? Mm-hmm. And so what they did then was they examined, well, are people who claim to be more religious and spiritual more or less happy, more or less filled with a sense of well-being than compared to people who aren't? And overwhelmingly, the studies found, whether it was depression or positive emotions or physical health or altruism, volunteerism, helping society out, that people who were more religious or spiritual were better off than people who weren't in these dimensions. So in terms of the utility that religion brings to society, and I want to be clear here too, that religion, because of spiritual sickness, of the people who adhere to a certain religion, bring many detriments to society, but we can say that about a lot of things. So we could say, gosh, science has given us hydrocodone as a painkiller. How beneficial has that been for many, many people who have had surgeries or accidents that's been able to alleviate their pain? But 40,000 people a year die from overdosing on hydrocodone and other opiates that are produced by the pharmaceutical industry to the benefit of millions. But we look at the cost because we go, the cost is newsworthy. The cost is a dog bites, not a dog bites man, but a man bites dog sort of lead. 40,000 people a year die from opiate overdoses. It's a tragedy. Yeah, it is a tragedy. But what's not mentioned in that article is how many millions, if not billions of people are able to use that medication to alleviate their suffering post-surgery or post-accident, so that they're not, because they've shown, lots of quantitative studies have shown the benefits and the recuperative times that are shortened when people are given painkillers. They recover much faster.
Yeah.
There's a huge benefit there. People get back to work sooner. They're able to earn an income sooner. All these other benefits that we could go on and on about. But media-wise, sensational-wise, we go, 40,000 people a year die. It's a tragedy. Well, yes, it is a tragedy. But scientifically, we have to look at what was the benefit. Same thing with religion. Radical Islam, horrible, horrible. People are dying. Gays are getting thrown off of roofs. People are getting their heads chopped off. But man, there's billions of people who use religion for benefit in their lives, the lives of their family, and the lives of society as a whole. So where do we draw that line? It's more sensational to look at the gays getting thrown off the roof and go, how horrific is that? The excesses of religious adherence. But we don't look at the less sensational headlines of how many benefits come out of having religion in our society.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I kind of agree with you, like everything has its goods and bads, but
absolutely.
The problem that I have with religion is, for one, we really have no evidence that it's true. So we're giving people potentially false hope, and we're teaching people to ignore facts and just go off of what makes you feel good. And I mean, because that's kind of what you're saying, basically, is it provides people all of these host of benefits, basically whether or not it's true. And in my opinion, I think that leads to, for one, it makes people suffer because, we don't know when someone's going to come to terms with whether or not it's true or not. And when that time comes, they could become depressed and harm themselves, or like go down a path like I did, which is, I would say that like coming away from a religion was really harmful for me in a way, because I didn't really understand what life was and all these things. And then slowly I had to rebuild this foundation that I crushed myself. Right. But when we raise people in these environments that aren't factually driven, then I think it sets people up for failure. And
how so? Because so it seems to me that much of what you just said was a very personal experience, where I could point, especially in my work with men in the recovery rooms for porn addiction, I could point to dozens and dozens and dozens of lives that have been beneficially impacted by the result of going through recovery in the AA room or the SAA room, following the concepts of the 12 steps of recovery. And the 12 steps of recovery, there's nothing scientific about them at all. At all.
Yeah.
It's like, I have to admit I'm helpless in the face of this addiction.
But that's a crazy admission though, right? I mean, because I don't know, it's like you're giving away your power to fix your addiction. Like you're saying I am powerless.
But every time I get in a car and drive somewhere, I'm giving away my power to get somewhere more slowly. Every time I take a pain medication, I'm giving away my power to heal myself naturally. Every time I rely on a surgeon to cut me open and put a stent in my heart to increase the blood flow so I don't die of a cardiovascular, issue. I'm giving away my power to heal myself. I mean,
Yeah, I suppose that's a good point. Yeah. I never really thought about it like that. It's interesting.
I mean, our reliance on so many things outside of our own control.
Yeah.
Spirituality and religion is just one more instance of, this microphone. It's an incredible concept of technology. I have little to no idea of how it actually works, or how the electronic signal that my voice gets converted into travels over into the headphones that you're wearing right now. I could tell you the basic principles of it, but I have no power or control over it, let alone any understanding of really how it works.
But I don't really
understand. There are people who do.
Yeah.
And the evidence is evident to me. I can look at it and go, it's working.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing with the concept of using a higher power to do something for me that I couldn't do myself. I don't understand how it works, but I know that it does. I see the proof of it in the rooms all the time.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's really what the utility argument comes down to. Is there quantitative proof that I can lay my hands on to show that there is some benefit to being spiritual or religious? And 3,300 studies parsed out according to how qualitative they were done, their qualitative dimensions, show almost conclusively as you can get in the area of science, being that it's run by people, right? That there's some real lift to it, and we can focus all day long around the detriments that religion brings to society when it's misapplied, or misconstrued, or used to abuse as an excuse to extend my power over other people or to make myself feel better. But I can say that about so many things in our society. Nuclear energy. So many good things can come out of nuclear energy. We can provide cheap, abundant electricity by splitting atoms, but there's a cost to it.
Yeah.
The cost to it is that now we have these horrific weapons that can be used to wipe out millions of lives in a heartbeat, right? Yeah. We've got all this nuclear waste that lies around and is radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years.
Right.
And you scratch your head and you go, is it worth it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I just think that, I think it's really easy for us. I mean, those research studies are interesting, but I think it's really easy for us to talk about this. And I mean, if religion was what you're describing religion to be, I guess I could see how that there could be utility in it, because you're using such a broad stroke of the brush to define it. But I just think that a lot of the reason why you see utility in it has to do with the fact that we are lessening our adherence to religion. It's like, yeah, when we talk about religion in a way that's just a higher power, that's so generalized that I mean, I could say that, when I read astrology, it makes me feel like, I'm going to have a good, productive day, and it defines my personal characteristics in a way that I really appreciate. It makes me feel better about the universe and all these things. But that doesn't mean that it's true. And it doesn't mean that relying on it for my daily information is going to help. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not going to really help.
I do. So it's a chicken or egg question, right?
Yeah.
Is it the religion that's increasing my own sense of self-worth that therefore leads to all these benefits, etc.? Maybe. It's you can't point at it scientifically and say yes, but what we can also point at scientifically is say that it helps people get through adversity better too. But again, it's a chicken or egg.
How do you
question.
figure it helps people get through adversity?
Oh, it's part of these studies. So let me go find that particular section. It's funny. This guy had pages and pages and pages of stuff, and I went through and I copied and pasted a lot of stuff just to kind of summarize it for myself.
Yeah.
And now it's like, oh gosh, where was that? He had a whole section on adversity. Oh, here it is. So there is both qualitative and quantitative research suggesting that religion and spirituality helps people to deal better with adversity, whether it's external or internal. And so what he means by that, external adversity would come in the form of difficult environmental circumstances. So whether that's a natural disaster or death of a loved one, loss of a job, etc., or an internal adversity. So I've got some sort of genetic predisposition to a disease or a vulnerability to certain mental disorders. What they found was that there is research in these 3,300 studies that he pulled that points fairly conclusively to the fact that religion and spirituality helps these people to better deal with those adversity when they come along. You know, it's funny because even in church today, so they had a whole bunch of young people up on the stage talking about their own personal feelings about why it is that they've come to Christ, and the feeling that it helps me to set aside these bad things that may be going on in my life, and to recognize that there should be a greater purpose or a greater focus on something outside of that one event. So let's say I lose my job, I go bankrupt. Horrible thing to go through, right? I've lost my house, my cars, all these things that as a materialistic society, especially, we tend to put stock in, right? So, and you see it in our culture all the time. You know, who's got the flashiest car? Who's got the better house? But at the end of the day, what religion for me and spirituality mean for me, and apparently these studies show this too, is that those aren't really that important. What's really important is, am I loving, kind, and compassionate toward others? That's really what matters, regardless of my circumstances, regardless of whether or not I adhere to the strict code of my religion. And that was a big problem that Jesus addressed when he came along. He's like, you had all these Pharisees and rabbis who were going around going, let me go to the temple and pray. And then they would look at the guy next to him and go, well, I put more gold in the offering than you did.
Yeah.
And Jesus is like, no, that's a fundamental issue. The person who comes and puts a penny in the tithing basket, who's extremely poor, is far better off spiritually than the person who's extremely wealthy and comes and throws in $100. Whose offering was more generous and coming more from the heart? Whose offering was more meaningful and sacrificial, right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting dynamic. And again, it goes back to the whole chicken and egg thing. Is it my belief in religion that provides benefits, or is it the religion that provides the benefits? Because studies have shown routinely that we can convince ourselves mentally of something and do superhuman things that don't seem possible because of our belief that it can be done.
Right.
So is it the religion that's providing that, or is it my own psychological functionality and my belief in it that's doing that?
Yeah.
I don't really care either way, because it's still providing the same lift, same benefit.
But don't you think that truth is important?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I believe truth is important. But 5 years ago, I read about a study that said caffeine is horrible for you.
Yeah.
And here, 5 years later, I read about another study that said it's healthy for you. Drink more.
Right.
It's like, so what is truth?
Well, I mean, I would say that truth is something that you have sufficient evidence for.
Well, but the guy who did the study that showed how detrimental caffeine was for you would say that's his truth. And the guy who did the study that showed how good it was for you would say that that's his truth.
So are you saying
both of them have evidence?
Okay.
Both of them were scientists.
Maybe they don't have enough evidence. And also, I mean, do you believe that there's objective truths?
Yeah, but okay. I also believe that we're human, and our ability to get to an objective truth with a capital T is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible.
Hmm.
Just like these scientists who went about doing these studies saying, hey, I found this evidence and it seems to point to the conclusion that caffeine is bad for you. And the other guy did the same study and said, but I found evidence that it's good for you. Well, okay, whose evidence is better? Which one's the truth? And unless you're superhuman, it's going to be really difficult to understand which one's true with a capital T.
Yeah. Well, I just think that like believing something without sufficient evidence. So I would say that maybe the caffeine studies weren't sufficient evidence, you know? I mean, maybe they didn't have sufficient evidence. Maybe we still don't have sufficient evidence, right?
Right.
But doesn't that mean that you as a person should look at those and say, okay, I don't know this for 100% truth because nobody knows anything. I mean, in science, there are more likely, less likely things. There's no scientist that says, you know, like even the law of gravity, or it's not a law, but even the theory of gravity isn't something that any scientist would say is 100% true, right? So,
yeah, because it's still a theory.
Right. Yeah. So, but that being said, I guess like me personally, I would say that something like gravity, or we can use your caffeine example. I don't know for sure that gravity is true. It seems like it probably is, you know.
Evidence seems to point that way.
Evidence seems to point that way.
Right.
But I'm not going to put my beliefs into it because I don't really like if someone came along tomorrow and said, hey, turns out gravity's not real, like it would have zero bearing on my life personally, I guess. And with religion, it seems like you have to take a whole lot of presuppositions before you know, before it is able to help you. And that's the utility of it is how it can be an aid in your life. You're taking all these presuppositions that you really have no evidence for. I mean, we don't even know for sure if Jesus existed. There's a lot of debate to that.
Well, we don't know for sure if a whole lot of historical figures existed. We just know that we have writings about them, and we suppose that the people who made those writings were, you know, somewhat impartial observers.
But wouldn't you agree that Jesus is a little special in the sense that he had superhuman abilities, like being resurrected?
Yeah.
So
that's the cool thing about it.
Well, okay, but the idea that someone like Alexander the Great or someone, you know, along those lines existed isn't really all that difficult to believe, because when they talk about Alexander the Great, they don't talk about Alexander the Great challenging, you know, physical like abilities. You know, it's not like they're talking about someone that had a birth from a virgin and came back to life after they were allegedly dead. So I guess my point here is that with like you being a Christian and you seeing the utility in these beliefs, and I mean, you might see the utility in all beliefs. I'm not sure. It seems like you do, but when we're telling people, okay, these are going to help you, go to church, this is the best medicine for your problem right now, like they have to presuppose that this is even real.
Right. But
that's like a lie. I just don't see how that could be a foundation, because it seems like you're basically accepting something with poor evidence to make yourself feel better in the moment. I don't see how that can be a real stable foundation, whether or not these studies point that direction.
So it's interesting, and that's what's interesting about human behavior as a whole, right? So there's plenty of studies that show that we can give people fake medicine, sugar pills.
Yeah.
What do they call that? Placebos. That we can give them placebos and
they can reverse disease.
Right. And you know, that somewhat miraculous things happen. And then scientists sit there and scratch their head and go, wow, what do we do with that? Right. And so that's actually a pretty foundational study about the efficacy of medicine, is compared to a placebo, how effective is this medicine?
Yeah.
And then they also compare the placebo to just no treatment at all.
Right.
And what they found is that even giving placebos in a lot of cases provides some sort of lift physically, but there's so many variables that go into that, you know, diet, attitude,
Yeah. I
sufficient
think
rest, all these things that we
I
can't
almost think that
go.
this is a good thing against your argument, though. You know what I mean? Because you're saying that within the uh, within our understanding of science, there's this mystery of how the body can do
Yep.
things and heal things
Yep.
outside of what we thought was in our control, and and I guess what I'm saying is religion could be the same thing. And the problem that I have with it is it seems like with like prayer, prayer. Have you seen the studies on prayer where there's actually it has adverse side effects?
Most of the studies I've seen show that it has beneficial effects.
Okay, well, there was a study by what's that? I don't know if it's the Pew Foundation, but there's like um, a religious study foundation that's based in religion. I can't even think of what it's called right now. But anyways, and they monitored tons of people that were being prayed for, and the people that knew that they were being prayed for had adverse side effects like higher blood pressure and things like that because they were expecting something, and that expectation,
Right. Some sort of miracle was going to
right?
happen.
So that
So
expectation caused a negative side effect. So
here's the thing. You know, prayer or not,
yeah,
for me, prayer is about building a relationship with my higher power. That doesn't mean that good things are always going to happen to me in this world. And that to me is a false belief and something that I don't think is a true teaching of God. So God never says, well, man, if you pray enough, you'll get extraordinarily wealthy.
right.
And he never says, if you pray enough, all these great things will happen to you as a result.
Yeah.
That's not because those are all for me and extraordinarily selfish things. So if I'm sick and I pray enough to get better, all I'm doing is praying for me.
Yeah.
That's selfish.
Okay. Maybe not. I mean, what if it's because you have a family that's reliant upon you?
Well, okay. So different story, right? We can parse that out all day long. But at the end of the day, the question comes down to, am I expecting something to benefit just me, or am I truly being selfless and trying to watch out for others around me?
Yeah.
Right.
If you have 10 kids and you're praying for yourself and you die, what does that mean?
Well, that means that they might go through some serious shit.
Yeah.
But therein lies choice again, right? So if I lose a father, if my parents divorce, if I get cursed with cancer, what am I choosing to do as an individual with that event in my life? Am I letting that drive me away from a relationship with God or toward a relationship with God? Am I letting that drive me towards selfish behaviors where I'm looking out for numero uno, which is a popular saying in our culture? What were you doing? Well, I was just looking out for numero uno.
Yeah.
Right. Or am I letting that drive me toward behaviors that are selfless and looking for ways to be helpful toward others as a consequence of going through that negative event or negative experience?
Right.
And that's, to me, where the utility of religion and religious beliefs comes in. If I'm misapplying it for my own selfish purposes, then I'm really not adhering to the teachings of a lot of major world religions. I'm using it to benefit me and me alone. But if I'm expecting something different, not necessarily in my own self-interest, and I might use that experience to be helpful toward others, regardless of what's going on with me, regardless of how crappy my own personal experience may be in the moment, am I using that to be helpful toward others?
But don't you see?
It's a simple question.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do agree with you on that. But I don't you see how having a false belief. Now, I mean, we obviously haven't even gotten into whether or not religion is true, but don't you think that having a false belief can lead you towards a path of destruction in a way? I mean, I just like, I guess, for example, like if I truly believe that I am going to marry Anna Kournikova and I
But
live,
are you doing that for selfish reasons?
maybe not. Maybe I think that it would make her life much better. Okay. But if I truly believe in my entire heart that that's what I'm going to do, and this is giving me hope to get through the day, is that right? I mean, is this like really providing my life a true benefit, or is it just the veil of benefits? I mean,
Well,
and I guess my point is if we look at religion in this context of, we don't know for sure if it's true or false, right? I mean, I don't know if you are certain that religion is, or Christianity is true, or if you're more of an agnostic Christian. It's like, maybe it is, maybe it's not, but I'm gonna what?
no, it's, I mean, and that's the thing about religion,
Yeah,
or your belief in the supernatural. And again, it comes back to the chicken or egg thing, right?
right.
So either I'm all in or I'm all out.
Okay. Well,
Right.
I mean, yeah.
And
There's
so,
definitely people that ride the line. They're like,
oh yeah,
I'm worried
yeah.
that hell is before me, so I'm just going to pretend like I'm a Christian. There's definitely a lot of those characters, but
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, those are the what I call the check the box people, right?
right.
So the check the box people, and Christ was really clear about this. If you're just doing this to check the box, you're not following my teachings.
But if well, I mean, if there is not sufficient evidence for something, and someone is like just doing it to check the box because in the back of their mind they know that there's not sufficient evidence for it, then what kind of moral God would not be okay with that? I mean, I just don't like. Here's kind of my thing: is if Jesus was real and Jesus was God and he was resurrected, why wouldn't he just hang out for the rest of eternity on the earth, telling everybody like, see guys, I was resurrected. This is the history of me. I've been here for 2,000 years now. And then there would be no doubt. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like
But then there would be no choice. There would be no freedom.
Okay. So that's an interesting argument, because I would say that there really is no freedom to begin with because God knows everything.
But maybe he does and still allows us to have freedom of choice.
How could God allow freedom of choice if he knows the outcome?
Well, so let's use a really crude example of that. Let's say I walked up to you and said, Eric, I'm going to punch you square in the nose.
Okay.
And you knew from my previous behaviors that there's a good likelihood, or even a 100% likelihood, that when I say that, the act will follow my statement.
Uh-huh.
At that point, you still have a choice whether to duck or not, or whether to scat out of the area or not, right? But let's say you say, well, gosh, I know Russ is going to do this. The outcome isn't going to be great, but hey, this is the way it is. He's got the freedom to do this. I've got the freedom to duck or not. So in that example, if you're God and you know the outcome is going to be painful, but you go, man, I really hope Russ is going to learn someday that hitting people in the nose just isn't a very kind, loving thing to do. That's my hope. He may or may not get there. And in fact, I know he won't, but I'm still going to hope. I'm still going to let the course of events just go until maybe Russ comes to me, or maybe he doesn't.
Do you think God has free will?
Gosh, I have no idea. How do you know God? I mean, that's kind
Well,
of the underlying whole argument, right? Is like there's no quantitative proof that without a doubt he exists. But isn't that kind of the whole point of the thing? Is that if we knew for sure he existed, wouldn't that remove our freedom to make choices about whether or not to believe in him?
Because
if I came to you and I said, Eric, I have indubitable proof that God exists, where does your free will go?
Well, I mean, just because something exists doesn't mean that I need to believe or
Well,
not believe. Okay, you don't choose your beliefs, but just because I know some things exist doesn't mean that I need to still follow him and
but
worship
some
him.
of your free will goes away.
How do you figure? I mean,
No,
because
because if you used this example earlier, if God really wanted us to know what he existed, why wouldn't Jesus have just continued to hang out and be immortal here on earth?
uh-huh.
But I would say that if that were the case, some of our ability to choose or not choose goes away. If not, all of it goes away.
Well, but
Then we
wait,
go,
wait, wait,
well,
wait.
there's evidence of the mystical right there.
So, but hang on, because the thing is like if Jesus and God were real and I met Jesus tomorrow, and I mean, first of all, well, I'll get back to that in a second. But if they were real, then that, like, I personally, this is just me. Like, let's say that I knew for sure the God of the Bible was real and Jesus was real. I would not follow him because I would find him abhorrent. And that this is just the truth. I mean, I would think that killing, every man, woman, and child on the planet except for Noah and his family was terrible. And all these stories that I hear are just ruthless. So I would not be
Right.
making the choice to follow him. So I still would have free will. I'd willingly go to hell, right? So I guess I would still have the free will to make that decision, wouldn't I?
Oh, I would hope so, but I'm not God, so I don't know. But to get back to your example of if that were the God truly, that he was some sort of ruthless extinguisher of spirit and hope and salvation, is that the kind of God I would want to follow? No, that's not the God I would want to follow either. But I think we have to be careful too that the writings in the Bible are man's understanding of what they think God's will is,
But what
right?
about like when God in the Bible, I mean, in the teachings in like I think Leviticus, God says that this is my word, the one true law. Like this is like,
But who wrote that?
but if he's giving this revelation to someone who wrote about Jesus? That's
Yeah,
just a man. That was just a
exactly.
man hundreds of years later, and
Thousands.
that
Yeah,
thousands and the
yeah.
testimonies of these people. I mean, for all we know, they could have all been smoking crack or something. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
and so I
So
just don't. I
the
just don't
question is,
understand how you can balance the God of the Old Testament just being that, and the God of the New Testament being this, and one is true and one is fake, just based on your own moral code.
yeah. So here's the thing, buddy, and this is where it becomes instead of we started off with the idea of is there any sort of utility to religion
Yeah,
in our
yeah, we've
society
kind of gotten
today,
off
right?
off that. Sorry.
That's okay, but I think this comes down to the benefit to the individual versus the benefit to society. And now we're talking about the benefit to the individual. And because it's a benefit to the individual, it becomes an incredibly personal experience, right? And so can do, would people accuse me of being a cafeterian Christian? Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
The cafeterian Christian being the person who goes and picks out the ones that they want to believe. But at the end of the day, what has to happen is you have to build your own personal individual relationship with God.
So
I can't do that for you.
right.
And Leviticus couldn't do that. And Abraham couldn't do that. And Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John couldn't do that for me. Can I look at their writings and go, hey, I like some of what has been said here. Do they match up with what I know about what Jesus said about truth, love, compassion, forgiveness, grace? Do they match up against that? Some of them don't. And I go, man, I don't know that I want to adhere to the idea that we should stone a witch.
Right.
That doesn't sound like compassion, love, forgiveness, grace, kindness to me, right? But history has shown that people have used religion for all manner of excuses. I mean, look at fundamentalist Mormons who think that somehow polygamy. I almost said polygraphy. Maybe that's a Freudian slip.
Yeah, that's writing many languages.
Yeah, right. So, well, polygraph is
Yeah.
used to to supposedly determine whether you're telling the truth or not.
Oh yeah.
But polygamy, they found evidence in their teachings that somehow polygamy is a divine calling from God. Well, I don't know, but it's led to all manner of abuses that have occurred, including sexual abuse of very young girls.
Yeah.
And you go, well, that doesn't match up with what I know to be kind, loving, forgiving, compassionate. And anybody who leaves that belief system is an outlaw to them. And then it's an automatic ticket to hell.
Right.
It's like, really? Well, how do you reconcile that against the fundamental human benefits of being loving, kind, compassionate, forgiving? And science has shown that there's a lot of benefit to having that sort of a disposition toward your fellow human beings.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, do you think that Paul has free will? Because he had like a
Paul the Apostle?
Yeah, he had the Damascus Road experience,
Well,
where Jesus revealed himself to Paul. So wouldn't that be taking away Paul's free will?
Yeah. I suppose you could argue that it perhaps was, but to your earlier point, maybe Paul, if he was like Eric, would go, yeah, that was probably just I ate too many mushrooms on the road to Damascus.
Right.
I want that. I find that apparition to be true, but I still really hate Christians, and I don't care if that apparition was true, because that was the insane thing about what happened to Paul, was that he was actually a persecutor
of
Christians. He actually helped to kill Christians.
Right.
Well, he wasn't active in the killing of Christians, but I think I read somewhere that somebody described him as the coat boy, or the what do they call the guys that take coats and hang them up?
Yeah.
At a restaurant.
Yeah.
So he was taking coats and hanging them up on the rack for the guys who did the killing, right? And Paul carried an incredible amount of guilt around about that, and so you could argue that apparition was his own mental torture about the guilt around what he'd done. But here's the thing: he became the most active recruiter, if you will, of converting people to Christianity, and his writings are filled with the concepts of grace, compassion, and forgiveness that he personally experienced and wanted to extend toward his fellow human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it was an apparition or it was actually Jesus that appeared to him on the road to Damascus, if you're really an adherent to, well, I want scientific proof kind of guy, then I would say, well, who cares if it was the chicken or the egg? Shouldn't we be looking at the outcomes if you're just a pure science kind of guy?
Mm-hmm.
And the scientific evidence on this is pretty clear that people who are more religious or spiritual, can it be abused? Absolutely. Can it have horrible, horrific outcomes? Absolutely. And those are headline grabbing type things, right?
Yeah.
But by and large, when we look at studies, there is overall a definite lift to society and a definite lift in individual health, mentally and physically, if you're more religious or more spiritual than not. And so when I look at the overall argument about the utility of religion, if you just want to be a science guy and go, well, I'm going to shed my disbelief. So it's kind of like walking in, and we learned this concept in the study of literature. It's called the willing suspension of disbelief, right?
Yeah.
Am I willingly able, or do I willingly desire to suspend my disbelief and to believe that which is not immediately apparent, not provable, not factual, not data driven, because I know that if I do that, if I surrender my disbelief, that there will be positive outcomes especially for those around me. If I adhere to what Jesus was really trying to say, was spread the love. That was really his message. Spread the love.
Yeah.
And it was almost kind of like hippie-ish sort of approach, right?
But why do we need religion to spread that message? I just don't. I guess I don't see how. I think that if we could just teach these things fundamentally to people, then
Do we? secularly? Do we teach that?
I think so. I mean,
Really? Where?
absolutely.
Where? Show
I
me, show
well,
me in
okay.
the public education system, for example, that's been set up where they say, love one another. Just love one another.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, but maybe that means that we just need to work on secularism. But
Maybe.
yeah, but I mean, the thing is when we look at society and culture, and we can scientifically look at society and culture, we can see the benefits in doing these things. I mean, there's huge benefits to a productive society if we live by those rules and laws. And if that's what you're getting from religion, I mean, then you're just going to have a more productive society, I suppose. But and so I could see the utility there, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the baggage of religion needs to be there. I don't really see the point in a higher power if we can just teach the fundamentals of, don't be a dick to, you know,
Right. Well, it's funny that you say that because when the founders of Google first started operating, one of their corporate maxims,
don't do evil things.
yeah, don't be evil,
Yeah.
right? And now you look at what they're doing and how they've lost sight of that
I
fundamental.
think they even took it out.
They did actually, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of 4 years ago or something like that. They said, well, that doesn't need to be part of our corporate ideology anymore.
Right.
And it's like, really? And now you look at some of the things that they're starting to do, and you go, that feels kind of evil to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're tracking me on a microscopic level, right? Knowing and there's been no evidence that this has happened, so I don't want to say that it has, but the potential for abuse is huge.
Right.
Right?
I agree. Yeah.
And so you go, well, so if we could embody some sort of secular code that taught things like love comes first, relationships come first, compassion, forgiveness, kindness, altruism come first. If we could start teaching that at a scientific level, I would say, man, that's a lift. Even if people say, well, I don't want to subscribe to the idea of God anymore because of that, I would still say that that's a lift. I would say that completely ignores the idea that there are eternal ramifications for what we do. And maybe that could be captured scientifically too. Like generationally is generational impacts are a form of eternity. Okay, I could subscribe to that, but I think science has also shown that humans just simply don't adhere to that idea because they're all about the here and now.
Right.
And it's really, really difficult.
But
And you see it with parents all the time who look at their children and go, you're a hindrance to me, not a blessing. And because they're focused on the selfish and the here and now. And so how does science help those people to understand there's that self-sacrifice and giving up something that you want right now is somehow beneficial to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, your mom is over there in the door going, 2 hours.
Has it really been that long? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, we started. Well, actually, it's probably been, it's right at 2 hours. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I guess we can start to wrap it up, but I would just say that fear of eternal damnation is not any way of trying to have a productive society.
But eternity is more than just damnation.
It could be potentially,
could be. Right.
But
and it's part and parcel with.
But the thing is we don't have any evidence of eternity. So it's like when people are talking about like eternal punishment or something like that, that they can make up whatever things they want to go along with that. Like, for example, I was listening to a phone call where a guy was talking about he kind of has a very similar stance that you do about, like love each other, don't encroach on other people's things, and that, and it was like really awesome. I was like, okay, if every Christian talked like this, like there would be no problems. And then right at the end, he says, well, except I don't think that God likes promiscuity. And it's like, wait, what are you talking about? How do you have evidence for this? There's no real evidence. And so the problem is I think that we
You mean
take
evidence of God saying that, or evidence that promiscuity is somehow bad for us?
we don't have any evidence that God doesn't like promiscuity. And the problem with taking that approach is that now, I mean, and this is just one person's example, but his example was, we should stop people from being promiscuous because God doesn't like it. And so it's like now all of a sudden you're encroaching on someone else's freedom to be promiscuous or
Well,
to be promiscuous if they choose.
so if I just look at the scientific evidence of promiscuity, the statistics are rather horrible. So the more promiscuous a person is, the more likely they are of catching a venereal disease, and then
Yes, I
perhaps
agree with
not
you.
even knowing that they have a venereal disease, like the human papillomavirus,
Yeah.
which creates, if I recall correctly, it creates cancer, if I'm remembering this correctly,
Okay.
and also contributes to birth defects. And I'm trying to remember, and I may be mistaken about that, but I do know it's harmful. Let's just leave it at that. Harmful to the other person, harmful to perhaps the infant. But there's all kinds of evidence that the people who are not promiscuous are healthier, better off mentally.
Right. But
Right.
now you're using science to explain this instead of
Well,
religion.
but where did the idea of not being promiscuous come from?
I would argue that it came from people having the negative experiences of promiscuity and
Perhaps
then
codifying it into religious principles.
right. I mean, and that's just like I was saying earlier with the pork. I mean, and
Right.
that is why we see religious morality change constantly as culture changes. I mean,
Right.
I don't see how it can be rectified that like we could use the exact same argument for homosexuality. Okay?
Well, let's back up to the idea that maybe there was some sort of negative outcomes to promiscuity, and so religious leaders said, "Aha, we need a new rule," right? Rather than
Uh-huh.
it being God driven.
But I don't think that I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off here, but I just want to make this point. I don't think that it is that cut and dry, and I think to simplify it like that is not putting weight into it at all, because I think that it's more so people suffered adverse side effects from these actions, and they thought God was punishing them.
Oh, yeah. So I see what you're saying. So that's an interesting thing, because we see evil people go through life seemingly blessed with many materialistic benefits.
Okay.
Right. So, I'm trying to think of an example. Examples
Jeff
abound.
Bezos. I would say
Well, I don't know Jeff, so I don't know how evil or not he is. But
well, it depends on how you define evil, because I mean, I guess I would say that he's like the definition of, like unfair capitalism, but
well, perhaps, yeah. So,
I don't really believe in evil, but when I do think of like what evil can be, it's like I would say that kind of what you're saying, not treating people with respect and being worth $140 billion or whatever and still paying employees $15 an hour is just ridiculous. So
right. Yeah, and you could probably make a case that something is spiritually wrong with him as because he's hanging on to all that. It's like filling some sort of trauma-driven need that he's developed, right? Who knows? Yeah. I'm not Jeff Bezos and I'm not close to him, so I can't speculate. But
right, yeah.
But at the end of the day, good things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people. Would I necessarily, let's say that I was an extremely penitent, church-going, giving, sacrificial, selfless person, but something really horrible happened to me. Would I use that as an opportunity to say, God is punishing me for something I missed? Or would I say, you know what? This is simply an opportunity to, and this is I heard this several years ago and I really like it. If I don't like the way something looks, maybe I should change the way I'm looking at it. And what I mean by that is, I'm really good. I've gone to church every day. I've paid tithing. I get cancer.
Mm-hmm.
I could look at that as to say, I must have missed something, and therefore I deserve this cancer. What did I miss? And then I could say, and let's say in my retrospective, I say, I didn't miss anything. I did everything God asked me to. Now I'm angry at God because I've got cancer.
But now we understand what cancer is.
But wait a second, though. But
Okay.
lots of people still do this, though. They take external events that happen to them and they become angry about them, and they use them as a way to go, I'm being punished for something by God. Mm-hmm. So whether it's cancer or whether it's a flood, right, doesn't really matter. But if I change the way that I'm looking at it, I change my perspective and I say, well, I got cancer, or a flood wiped out my family. What am I going to choose to do at that instance? Am I going to choose to turn away from God and blame him, or say God doesn't exist and that's why that happened, so I'm going to stop believing in him as a consequence? Or am I going to choose to look at that from another angle and say, this is an opportunity for me to learn something and turn toward God and the ideal that he would like me to strive for, to be more compassionate, forgiving, and helpful toward others? My family just got wiped out by a flood, but there's lots of other people who also lost family members. Maybe I should use some of my grief and pain and anguish and go help them, right? Which is a benefit to society. Yeah. Instead of going, man, I lost my entire family, I'm going to sit here and curse God and be angry about it, which doesn't lead to beneficial.
Yeah, I don't see either of those being beneficial, though, because you can sit there and curse God, which I don't tend to believe exists, or you can sit there and praise God, which I also don't tend to believe exists. So both of those is a waste of time, in my opinion.
That's not what God asked for. He didn't say, after this flood wipes out your family, I want you to praise me.
Well, no, I understand what you're saying. I'm saying that you don't even have to submit any or insert any God into this. You could just say, man, my family died. I guess floods are shitty and I'm going to help everybody get out of this shitty situation. Like, why do you need to insert a God into that at all?
Because that belief that there is something better waiting for us helps us to transcend the suffering that we have here on earth.
And I think that
transcendence is helped by the idea that there is a supernatural being who is kind and just and wants us to do good.
But
if I just approach it from a scientific perspective, after the flood, I go, I got to get what's mine. I'm going to look out for numero.
That's crazy. I mean, that's basically saying that without God, you would be running around raping and pillaging just because there's no, fuck it, who cares? I mean, but that doesn't lead to like a successful society. I don't think that, I don't see how that, to me, is that is a very common argument. Don't get me wrong. I know that that's a very common argument, but I would say that when we look at society and culture as a whole, okay, so when we talked on the phone the other day, you mentioned animals and how animals don't always, they look out for themselves oftentimes, and you don't see altruism in the animal community, right?
Well, right. So a lion begins to attack a herd of zebras. Uh-huh. On occasion, but not with great frequency, you may see a zebra sacrifice itself for a younger member of its herd.
Right.
On occasion, not with great frequency. In fact, I would say with very low frequency.
You know what else you don't see zebras do, though? Drive cars, listen to music, produce music. I mean, what I'm trying to say is we are a more advanced species. We're a more advanced version of animals.
Precisely right. But
so we understand.
We're also very unique.
Right. We're unique in the way that we deal with situations. Like, we don't know how to fly, so we create planes or something like that. But that unique response to life is, in my opinion, I guess I can see that how that enables us to do things like be altruistic and care about other people, because we know that that's in the long term the best way for survival. And it comes down to, maybe it does come down to selfish things of passing on genes, but it's selfless in the sense that it's for the better good of humanity. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, that there's some sort of genetic code built into us to watch out for descendants 500 years from now.
And I would even say that there's something built in.
That are selfless today.
Yeah, I would even say that there's something built into our genetic code to believe in religion.
if that's true, I have no idea. Maybe. Why would we be built to incline toward what I would call the mystic, the supernatural, the transcendent,
Uh-huh.
where evidence apparently shows that every other animal in this world do not?
Because I actually would disagree with you on that. There's been evidence of chimps like yelling at or screaming to the sky when there's thunder and lightning and trying to fight it. But that that is to
That
them.
doesn't prove belief in a supernatural, though.
But it does prove that as a survival mechanism, they think that something is directly happening to them. And so as a survival mechanism, they're trying to fight a higher, like something bigger. You know what I mean? Like they think that lightning is something
but
bigger.
not transcendent.
How do you know?
Something natural, but not transcendent.
Well, we don't understand.
That's the thing. That's what I'm trying to say is we don't know.
Right. But so the reason why I'm saying that I think that would be ingrained into our DNA or whatever genetics is because we as a species try to understand everything. And the people that throughout the history of time, the people that were able to ascribe meaning to something lent them an upper hand on survival. If you, for example, this is one that gets thrown out there way too much, but if there was a rustling in the bushes and we were on the Sahara in Africa and you heard a rustling in the bushes, the people that said, oh, it's probably just the wind, got eaten by an animal. But the people that said, oh, it's probably an animal and got out of there, whether or not it was the wind, were able to survive for another day. Right. So this is something that I think, like, throughout time, we try to look for meaning in everything because it helps us cope with survival. And I guess that's where I think religion comes from and why I think that it's built into our DNA, because we want to see a cause for everything, which we don't know what caused the Big Bang, but people do think that there has to be a cause and there has to be a meaning. And oftentimes people tend to think that meaning and cause is transcendent, the unmoved mover,
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is I do see a lot of similar animal tendencies, like just at a lesser version of what we do. It's like a much smaller condensed version of, like I'm sure if we gave chimps another 10,000 years or whatever, they might be worshiping a deity.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, that's the beauty of it all, is it really comes down to free will, right?
Yeah. I actually don't believe in free will, by the way. So,
wow, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I just like, I don't understand. I mean, and I really don't understand how a Christian could believe in free will either.
Why?
Because you didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose to be created.
Yeah, I didn't choose to have 2 eyes, a nose, 2 lips, teeth. I didn't choose any of those things. I got them.
Yeah, but I mean, at the right, which is kind of my point. When you branch out from that, you didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose to be born in, where were you born?
Colorado.
Colorado. You didn't choose to be born in Colorado. You didn't choose to grow up in the neighborhood that you grew up in, which ultimately molded you into the person that you are today. None of those things were your choice. So, but every decision that you make,
how to react.
But your reaction is based on your previous knowledge of.
I would say no, events. Because everything leading up to the revelation of my addiction was all in my head a choice to how I wanted to deal with the trauma coming out of my childhood, when I was not living according to what the lie that I had built up.
Yeah.
Suddenly I had a choice to make, and I wrestled with the choice.
But don't you think, though, that you didn't have the choice for that fork in the road to happen?
No, I did.
What do you mean you did? Yeah. You didn't choose for my mom to find out.
Well, no, but I did have a choice about how to handle it, right?
Yeah.
So I could have chosen to continue what I thought was an intellectually sound rationale for whether or not God existed. I could have chosen to continue down that path.
Yeah.
And said, well, there's got to be some sort of scientific solution to my addiction.
There probably was.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think they've come up with a solution scientifically for alcoholism. I can't just go take a pill for it.
Yeah, but I think that
because it's
I mean,
behaviorally driven.
Yeah, you and I just differ in the sense that I like what this is honest to God truth, honest to whatever truth. With my method with my meth addiction,
there's some irony.
I know, right? With my meth addiction, it's like when I started to understand what was going on in the brain, that was my first chapter of starting to fix myself, because I started to recognize like how dopamine receptors worked and what meth was doing and all these things. And I was like, okay, let's look at this objectively. Like, what am I really getting out of this? And what's the long-term looking like if I continue my destructive behavior? I mean,
yeah, but here's what I would say. So you've always been a really curious dude, right?
Yeah.
And I can remember even when you were, and I don't know if you were in or out of your drug addiction or drug use at the time, but I remember you being totally geeked out about the fact that they discovered the Higgs boson particle.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
And that was like 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Yep.
And so that was based on my personal knowledge of your history prior to you coming out of addiction, right?
Yeah.
And so I go, well, Eric's a naturally curious cat, right? He wants to understand all the inner workings of this or that or the other. But then there's still the unexplainable, the mystical that science can't put his hands around.
Yeah.
Like, why do we need to sleep? Science still hasn't cracked that code.
Still, but that's the key word. We still haven't, but we might someday. And I mean, I think that there's strides in learning about sleep. Like we have so much more knowledge than we did yesterday about it.
Yep.
And I just think that, I mean, I don't know. We're going to go back and forth on this point forever, I think. But
yeah, I mean, that's why I was an English major, because I tend toward the mystical, and you're a science dude. You tend toward gravitate toward the science, right? And for me, when you start to take the mystery out of the universe, to me, it becomes a little colder.
I so disagree with you on this, because like I look at like the Big Bang, or I mean the Higgs boson, or how, I mean, the craziest thing that we don't even think about ever, which is how light interacts with our atoms and like electromagnetism. And I see that, and I have been driving to work and started crying literally, because I thought about how the sun is producing this energy for life on Earth, and it's like this really beautiful, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely
amazing. But there's no supernatural stuff.
You're looking at it from this way. I'm looking at it from that way. And so we've both gotten to the same conclusion, just from vastly different perspectives. I look at it as, man, this is a miracle, a gift from God. And you go, this isn't a miracle at all. It's entirely explainable. We may not be able to explain it yet, but we'll get there someday, but it's still beautiful. And at the end of the day, isn't that really what we want?
Yes.
Is for everybody to go, man, we have a unique opportunity in front of us. Whether I got there through God or I got there through science, we can show that love, compassion, forgiveness, beauty are all intangible things that have benefits, right?
Yeah, but I mean, the problem though is that with religion, and this is just my opinion, but the problem with religion is that it slows down science, because then you just have the answer. Well, God did it.
Well, I would also argue that religion was the primary driver of science for many, many centuries.
I do agree with you, but they were the biggest dog in town, you know?
Well, I mean, true. Who else? But it wasn't up until the about 150 years ago that science and religion sort of started becoming their own separate disciplines.
Yeah.
Right.
But also you have to take into consideration that like people that made watches were also religious, and they drove watchmaking or anything else. Architects were paid off by the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like,
they were the only game in town kind of thing.
Yeah, they were the only thing in town. So where else could it have come from? That everybody was religious back then.
Right. Well, true. But it was religious institutions that funded and provided the material for these people to conduct their research.
Yes.
So they were funded by religion. So I just look like here in Boise, Idaho, we have these really marvelous medical centers. One's called St. Alphonsus, and one's called St. Luke's.
Right.
Funded primarily by people who had religious motivations in mind when they stood those institutions up to begin with. It was their altruism and their sense of compassion and dedication to helping out their fellow human beings that drove them into standing up institutions that I look at and I go, my goodness, the amount of medical technology and care that we get out of those two institutions alone is just amazing. Deaconess Medical Center in Spokane, where Jake was born, primarily driven by religious institutions. So, you go, man, how we got there and what we got out of it, were there bumps and grinds along the way? Yeah, there were. But some of those came from science. Some of those came from religion. Some of those came from just people being people. Because by and large, I look at the human population, I go, we're a bunch of idiots. We can't get out of our own way. But somehow,
I think it's so funny.
Somehow, some way, we kind of get there, right?
Whether I just think it's hilarious.
Means or scientific means. Yeah.
But I mean, I love it though, and I'm really glad that we do. I just think like
Jake's giving me the sign.
Okay, yeah, I know. We should wrap it up. Yeah, we should wrap it up. But we should do this again sometime because I think
I liked it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I don't know if we ever really got anywhere, but it doesn't matter. It was still a fun conversation. So.
At the end of the day, my hope is that whether you convince me or I convinced you, the more important thing is hopefully people will listen to this broadcast and go, man, there's some really great ideas in there one way or the other that might make me want to look into something.
Yeah, and also that differing views can provide healthy conversation instead of argument and confrontation. So
yeah, completely agree. All right, brother.
All right. Well, I love you, man. I'll talk to you later.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.